Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. My name is Naomi Greenfield, and I'm a commissioner on the Arlington Human Rights Commission and an Arlington resident, and I wanted to welcome you all to Double Take Arlington. You can give yourself a round of applause quickly. Someone is very excited to be here. This is the first event like this that we've done with the Human Rights Commission, and it was based on an event that I participated at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And the goal is really to encourage people to think about what their personal story is and learn how to tell the story and then share them publicly with the community in an effort to get to know people in your community and learn a little bit more about yourself in the process. So at the Human Rights Commission, we spend a lot of time, and especially this year, going through certain human rights and civil rights violations that are going around in our community that have unfortunately escalated a little bit in this past year. But we wanted to sort of take a step back and think about how can we help build our community so that we reduce the number of those kinds of violations. And I think a great way of starting is getting to know the people in our community. So tonight we're going to hear from 9 members of the Arlington community. Their stories range from a wide different of topics. I'll let them tell you what those are. And they aren't representative of all of the Arlington community, but they are 9 stories, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to them and thinking about their story and maybe even thinking a little bit about your own story. So they're gonna come up and tell their stories, and then afterwards I hope you'll stay and we'll have some more snacks and hope you'll get to meet someone new. All right? So, and I know they always say this in the theater, but everyone, can you turn off your cell phones? We're gonna start with Kathy and go from there. Thanks.
Okay, just to let you know, if you look in your program, it sort of has the little bios. We're not going to take the time to read all the little bios for everybody or introduce everybody. You'll have to just look in there. And I'm also the guinea pig for, can you hear me in the back? This is a, like, experiment with a mic. If you can't, just like go like that or something, or, okay. I'm a little nervous about mics. So if you look at my bio, you'll see that I am now the Poet Laureate of Arlington, and I wanted to tell you about the day that set me on the path. It was an August day in 2005, and it was a funny road as a starting place for that path. It was the main drag in Provincetown, which was a single-lane crazy crush of cars, two-way bicyclists, roller skating drag queens, and pretty much a solid wall of pedestrians. So I slogged along and slogged and slogged and slogged, and pretty soon the pet shops and the pet boutiques and the t-shirt shops thinned out, and I found myself in a quieter part of town. There was a rusty bowed gate, and there was the address that I was looking for. So, backstory. I was in Provincetown for a writing workshop at the Fine Arts Work Center, which was founded by Stanley Kunitz. And the end of July, a couple of amazing things had happened to Stanley Kunitz. Getting my prop now. He published this amazing book, which is called The Wild Braid. It's a book about poetry and gardens, which happen to be the 2 things that I care about the most in the world. And he turned 100 years old. So he talks in this book about his house in Provincetown, which was basically built on a big sand dune. And he had dragged bags of seaweed over and piled them up into terraces and made a garden there. And I really wanted to see his garden, and I really wanted to meet Stanley. And the problem was that he was really famous. He won the Pulitzer Prize, he won the National Book Award, he was twice National Poet Laureate, and his 100th birthday had created this huge media blitz. So I tracked down the phone number for his assistant, Janine Lentine, and I thought, well, I could call her up and I could say, I'm one of a couple of 1,000 people who were taking workshops at the Fine Arts Work Center this summer, and I would really like to have a personal tour of Stanley's garden and maybe a chance to meet him, because so I didn't call, and I didn't call, and then at the last minute I called. And Janine said, I said, you know, I said those things, and she said, oh, okay, sure, when do you want to come? So we made a time, and that's how I found myself there that day. So I let myself in, as Janine had said I could do, and I was just looking at the beautiful, Stanley's beautiful garden with the sort of swaying wind anemones there, and Janine came out and she said, Stanley's here, and he says, I'd like to meet you. So I went in, and Stanley was sitting in this big wing chair, and this is August, so he's got on a Mr. Rogers sweater and long pants, and socks and slippers, and his feet are a couple of inches above the floor. They're just kind of dangling there like a little kid's feet. And he looks kind of like Yoda. You know? He's all kind of gnarled up and luminous. So I gave him my book to sign, and he asked Janine for the day and the month and the year, because I guess when you've got 100, they start to float around a little. I had brought a poem about sunflowers because I had heard that he liked to hear poems. So I said, I have a draft of this poem that I'm working on. And he invited me to read it to him. So he turned his body towards me, and he listened more carefully than anybody had ever listened to a poem of mine before. He listened with every molecule of his being. And when I was done, he leaned over and he took my face in his hands. And he said, that won't take much work, dear. And I looked at his hands, which had these blue road maps on them. You know, they looked like my great-grandmother's hands. And I said to him, will you hold hands with me? And he gave me his hand. And we sat there. I would have sat there forever. They came and took him away for lunch. And when he left, I jumped up and I ran out of the house, and I ran all the way across the road down to the ocean, and I was crying. And I was crying and crying all the way back. I walked all the way back into town along the ocean. And he had opened something up in me, this poet, 100 years old, and he taught me that poetry should always be linked to generosity. Thank you.
So the year was 1993. I had just finished graduate school, and I was awarded a fellowship to spend a year in Moscow. I had been in Russia quite a few times before that, but I had not been there in the 2 years since the Soviet Union had imploded. And nothing could have prepared me for the types of changes I was going to see. Gone were the red and white propaganda banners on top of all of the buildings. And they were all replaced with advertisements for Western goods and for Ponzi schemes that would make Bernie Madoff blush. There were still state-operated stores with creative names such as bread, milk, fish. But there was also a burgeoning private enterprise. Some of them were multinational chains, but every corner was dotted with kiosks as well, where you could either exchange currency, buy a bootleg CD, or buy a Mars candy bar. I don't know why it was always Mars candy. All the changes, though, had been accompanied by some problems and some dislocations. Inflation had spiked, and everybody was talking about it. Crime had spiked, both organized and random, and everybody was worried about that as well. I knew almost nobody in Moscow when I went over, except for one guy who I had met in business school. His name was Arsen, and he was from Chechnya. Very well trim, well-dressed. I think he was working for a Swiss company in the city. But Chechnya, for those who don't know, is far down the southwest of Russia. Mostly Muslim, and the inhabitants there tend to have darker skin. And the Russians in other parts of the country really, what's that? The mic. Hello? The Russians in the other part of the country really saw them as, viewed them with a lot of suspicion. They saw them as gangsters, criminals, terrorists. So I remember Arsen came by my dormitory one day, and we were going to go down to an art flea market, and the house mother kind of watched over the floor of the house. She said to me, she said, "Why are you hanging around with a guy like that?" Hadn't said a word to him, but she just took one look at him. So that's when it started to sink in for me. So this one sunny Sunday, October day, Arsen and I decided to take a walk down to the, go down to the river where there was an art flea market that happened every week. If you think about art on the green here on Town Day, something like that, but a lot larger. We went down to the bus stop and we waited, and the bus never came, and that's not really anything unusual in Russia, so service dislocation or something. So we decided to walk the 1 or 2 miles down to the flea market. And as we started walking, we passed the central bank building for the Russian Federation, and it was completely ringed with riot troops. Now, there had been a lot in the news about tensions between Boris Yeltsin and the parliament, but this was the first time I really saw, outward evidence of what was going on. We continued on our way. A little ways further, we saw a small protest forming down one of the side streets. More evidence. But again, we just continued on our way, went down to the flea market. Maybe we spent an hour talking to the artists, looking at their work. And we turned to walk back to my dorm. We stepped out on the sidewalk, and we were suddenly confronted with 5,000 to 10,000 ultranationalist and communist demonstrators marching directly towards us, waving placards and banners, wanting to go back to the way that the Soviet Union had been before the crime, before the inflation. And my heart just started racing. I mean, this was the way back. I didn't know the city that well yet. So thank goodness Arsen was with me, and he said, well, let's cut across the river. We turned behind us. We went to go across the river to get out of the way of the marchers. And just as we did so, a line of riot troops started forming a line to block the way. They didn't want the protesters to get to the center of the city. But unfortunately, they were also blocking our way. So as we stood there, the gap between the angry protesters and heavily armed riot troops became smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, now my brain was really locking up. We went towards the police, and they saw that we clearly had nothing to do with what was going on. So thankfully, 2 of them swiveled their bodies, They let us slip through, and then they reformed their line. Got out halfway across the river, and we looked back behind us, and we suddenly saw a flurry of papers and placards and a jostling of bodies. This is when the two groups came together, and this was the first major altercation of this state of emergency in Moscow this year. We shook hands, jumped on the subway, and I shot back to my dormitory. I had a shortwave radio there, and I turned on the BBC World Service. During Soviet times, the shortwave signals were all jammed, but now I could get it, and I listened to a play-by-play of what was happening on the streets out around me. An armed band, a large armed group, had stormed the central TV and radio tower, Ostankino. This was for the signals for all of the country. And I listened with horror with reports as one by one by one, the TV stations went dark and went off the air. And as the reports came in of bodies littering the grounds outside outside the TV tower. In the ensuing days, there was a declaration of what was called a CHEPA, Чрезвычайное положение, a state of emergency. It was a curfew that was imposed at night, but we could move freely during the day. Smaller armed bands attacked independent newspapers during that time. Boris Yeltsin sent tanks against his own parliament building. He shot a hole right through the center of the building to flush out his opponents. And I saw one other thing happening. The police started instituting, supposedly random ID checks on the streets, but it was clear that they weren't random. Everyone they were stopping was darker skinned: Georgians, Armenians, Chechens. And during that month or so, something like 5,000 people were deported from the city of Moscow who had nothing to do with this political dispute. A lot of them were vegetable and fruit sellers at the markets. The police also came into our dormitory. They did door-to-door ID searches. I showed my passport, no problem, but they hassled the African exchange students who really had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict there. So I walked away from this experience with a couple of lessons, which maybe they seem obvious. The first is that the free flow of information is worth defending. And it's worth defending with your life if you want to preserve your freedom. The second is that when a society becomes overly polarized, you risk not only violence, but you also risk an increase in scapegoating of those who are perceived as the other. I think about that a lot today when we hear the debates about fake news. I thought about it when I saw the reports about Charlottesville. And I just pray that we and the rest of the world find salvation from the type of fate that befell Moscow in 1993. Thank you.
I was 12 when I first understood discrimination. Every year, the church I grew up in will attend this summer festival at the end of June. It's really similar to Town Day in the sense that every organization in town will have a booth, but instead of being on Mass Ave, like a major road, it was in a very bucolic setting. It was in the park of a castle called the Castle of Morsan. Morsan being a very cozy residential suburb in the south of Paris. So every year, my church will have a booth there, and my family and my friend will go. And then we'll just start talking with local residents and tell them all the things about why your church is great. So you need to think about it like a crash course in church marketing 101. And the thing too is young people were kind of required to be there because the strategy was if there's young people, we might attract other young people, and then parents will be there as well. And so we can kind of promote our church this way. And in between, we'll just go listen to live music, go around. And I was with the wife of my pastor. We went together just looking around, and a woman looked at me. She walked toward me, she stopped in front of me and said something to me. And I was a preteen, I was 12, so cell phone and iPhone didn't exist yet, but I was not listening anyway. And at that time, it was like a silence movie. I was not listening to what's going on, but I really vividly remember like the character of this movie. So on one side, there were the wife of my pastor, and I don't know what this woman said, but the wife of my pastor went ballistic. She was upset, and that was very surprising because she was and she's still like a British person, very proper. She has this cute British accent when she talks. It's speaking French. But nothing that was coming out of her mouth, or like even the shape of her mouth, nothing was like beautiful anymore about her. She was visibly very upset about something. She was mean, she was threatening, she was dangerous. And on the other side, there was this woman, and she looked really like stunned, afflicted, like surprised, like she was silent. And I wanted to go to her and say, hey, are you okay? Like, do you need something? I know this woman, but I'm sorry about like the behavior she's displaying right now. And it's just much later than I understood that this woman didn't need it, my compassion at any point. Whatever she said was ugly enough to have triggered like kind of erratic behavior from a British woman who usually, know how to behave in society. So that's the wife of my pastor. Like we were with her kid. We was with her kid, like a younger kid. But that's like she really, whatever happened, or whatever was said during that discussion, she really stood for me. And she protected me. At that time, my mother was not there. So my mother is an African immigrant, single mom. And she was working on the weekend. So usually she will take shift at the hospital she was working on as a pediatrician. And we never really talk about discrimination or racism at home. First, we didn't have time. And then I don't think my mom had word to define a situation or something she had no control over. So whenever something strange or dangerous or uncomfortable happened, like we would take public transportation most of the time, she would just tell us, and my sister and I, just close your eyes, close your ear, keep moving. Same thing at school. If something happened, just keep walking, keep moving. So that day in that spark, I didn't understand why the wife of my pastor just disregarded any rules that I internalized. Like she didn't move on, she really stopped, and I was like, my mom would be pissed. I mean, my mom would not understand like what she was doing right now. She's supposed to move on. And I wondered, I really wondered that day if my mother was there with me, whether she would have been able to protect me. So that's what I really learned is there's many different ways to fight discrimination. And one person can make a big difference. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alan Kaufman, and I'm an addict. I'm not addicted to drugs or to alcohol. I'm addicted to fiddle tunes and have for most of my life. Yeah, it's bitter. So I've lived in Arlington for the last 20 years, but I'm originally from New York City. And this story takes place in 1972 when I was 19 years old. I was already a pretty accomplished fiddler of some reputation. I was the teacher at the Fred Instrument School of Folk Music, teaching mandolin, fiddle, and guitar. Quite respected. I won a number of fiddle contests, authored a book. And one day I got a call. I got a call from an agent. And the agent was asking me whether I was free on the next Thursday to play for an event at the Cattleman Restaurant in Midtown, New York. And yeah, I said, I'm free. Tell me a little bit more about it. And he said, well, this is a marketing advertising blitz for someone who has a product who's coming to New York and trying to interest people in New York City and the East Coast to buying the product. And I said, can I ask who this is? And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Have you heard of Orville Redenbacher? At the time, I didn't know much about Orville Redenbacher, but then he explained to me, and he described to me what he looked like. And, you're probably familiar with packages like this, and he's a pretty well-known entrepreneur. Actually, I think Orville Redenbacher popcorn now has about 40% of the market of popcorn. But this is before the microwave days. But it was he was coming in to the New York City to familiarize the rest of us with his product. And so I got a call from the agent, and he asked me if I was free, and I said yes. And I asked him, tell me more about it. And he said, well, I want you to get the best musicians that you can find. Because it's really important. And somehow Orville Redenbacher, Alan, he found out about you, and he wants some homegrown music for this event, and he wants you to play it, and he wants you to assemble a whole bunch of really experienced people to play. So I asked the important question is, what's the budget? And he said, well, Alan, this is really his event. It's not really ours. I'm just a messenger here. I'm just communicating this, and what you can do, Alan, is assemble the best people that you know, and we'll work on the financial part, and I'm sure that at the gig itself, he'll have a check for you. So I did get together with the finest musicians I could find, and we got to the Cattleman Restaurant on that Thursday, and I was shown the place where we needed to set up, and we got all set up. We played, I thought, pretty well. I was kind of pleased with the sound in the room, and it's always a pleasure actually when you have a gig and you're asked to play with the best musicians, and you can afford to do that. Then you're going to feel really good about your music and how you're playing, and it's always an honor to play with really fine musicians. So the end of the gig came, and it was still a really kind of crowded space, and it was a restaurant, but they had bales of hay and bandanas all over the place. They tried to transform it into a real down-home environment. Eventually, I found Orville Redenbecker, and he was wearing his white shirt and his big bow tie and horn-rimmed glasses, just like that picture that you see on. He really did exist. There was a really Orville Redenbecker. So I finally found him, and I introduced myself, and he said, "Oh, Alan, I'm so glad you're here, and you were the person I was looking for to do this event with, and I really love your music, and I'm so glad that you were here, and it was such an honor for you to actually agree to do this," and I felt naturally very flattered. And I said, "Mr. Redenbecker, we had a great time playing for this event, but all my musicians are packed up and ready to go, and we're ready to load the gear into the truck, and I was wondering if we could settle up, because that way we can all go home." And then he said, "Alan, funny that you should say that. I want you to take a look at the room. You could see surrounding the room, there are hundreds of bags of popcorn. Hundreds of them. There were twice as many of these bags of popcorn, Alan, but now, it's been a successful event, and a lot of people have picked up their bags of popcorn, and I'm thrilled with the fact that this event has gone on so well. So, Alan, being that you are so skilled at what you do, I really want you to have them. I want you to have all these bags of popcorn because you really deserve it. Because this is gourmet popcorn, and you played so well, so it's really clear to me that you should be the one to have and walk home with all these bags of popcorn." Well, at that point, so I'm looking at Mr. Redenbecker, and I turn around, and I see a band behind me. Now, they can't hear what's taking place, but I'm in a very awkward predicament, So what I did was I did an about face. What happened was Redenbecker went off to Glad Hand and speak with a whole bunch of other people at that point. I went back to the rest of the band, and I looked at him for a while, and I almost felt like laughing, because he was so ridiculous, but I couldn't because I was really sad. And I said to them, "Let's get out of here. Your checks are going to be in the mail." And I went back home, and I took a couple of menial jobs, flipping burgers and working in a stationery store, doing telephone solicitation. And within 2 weeks' time, I had the money, and I sent the checks out. But it really taught me an important lesson. One is that I should always have a contract. The other one is that there are a bunch of people, and Orville Redenbecker is really part of what we would call today the 1%. And there are people out there who really don't respect necessarily the time and effort and dedication that artists of any type put toward what they do, and it's sad that people don't realize that people who, like myself, who dedicate their lives to the arts, it takes time and effort and in order to achieve those goals. But it is what it is, and my job is to protect myself and to know that in the future that I'll never, ever, ever play again for popcorn. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. The call came in to Grandma Dorothy's pink rotary dial phone. Can't hear? Okay. Closer. Okay. The call came in. Get better? Okay. So Grandma Dorothy's pink rotary dial phone. Still can't hear me? I'm trying here. I'm practically eating it. Okay. All right. Now? Okay. The call came in to Grandma Dorothy's pink rotary dial phone. I didn't cry. Maybe because It had been coming, excuse me, for a long time. Maybe because even though it had been coming for a long time, my 12-year-old brain was in shock. It was official. My best friend Kelly was dead. And it was time to go to Hebrew school. Kelly used to go to Hebrew school with me. We made tacos together in Girl Scouts. We spent zillions of afternoons playing and eating junky snacks at her house. She had black, shiny, shiny black hair and sparkling green eyes, and she was silly and fun. And my best friend. I remember one time, we were probably about 7, and we were sitting on her living room rug, and we started to stroke our legs like we were sexy ladies. And then we collapsed in giggles, thinking about the ridiculous idea that one day we'd be big enough, hairy enough, to shave those legs. But Kelly never got to shave her legs. When she was 8, she started getting these terrible headaches, couldn't concentrate, fell behind in school. By the time I was in 4th grade, and she should have been, she had become a bit of an outcast for failing the 3rd grade. And because I stuck with her, I was a bit of an outcast too. I don't remember taunts, I just remember all the kids pulling away, staying away. There were just 2 kids, really, from that time forward who wanted anything to do with Kelly other than me. First, there was Ginger. She was a year younger and wild. She was not fazed that Kelly had failed the 3rd grade. That girl was not fazed by anything. She took goody two-shoes, Kelly and I, under her wing and taught us to misbehave, shoplifting stickers, and even dining and dashing. And then when the brain cancer diagnosis finally came and the cancer treatment started, there was Marcy. She was a little bit older, very sweet, a little odd, and she found great purpose in comforting Kelly. The other kids didn't comfort Kelly at all. No encouraging words, no handmade cards, no visits when she was too sick to come to school. So that day when Grandma Dorothy's pink rotary dial phone rang, I went to Hebrew school. And I sat down at my desk, and then I heard the click-clack of the temple secretary's heels on the hallway linoleum. I instantly knew what she was coming to say, and that's when it hit me. I started to blubber before she spit out the words, "Your classmate Kelly is dead." I was all snot and moans. I couldn't stop. And the other 7th graders in the room, most of them just looked at me like I was a specimen at a freak show. A few of them looked away, and a couple of girls who I'd been friendly with turned bright red and sent me desperate, pleading looks with their eyes, begging me to stop embarrassing them by proxy. My only escape was to look down at the wooden desktop in front of me. It was covered in names that had been carved in by bored kids years before, but all those names just blurred through my tears and rage. So I wasn't surprised a few days later when our peers, those kids, didn't come to the funeral. As I recall, other than Kelly's brother, only 3 kids showed up. There was Wild Ginger, there was Lonely Marcy, and there was me. We were a motley crew, but we showed up. And I tried to give condolences to Kelly's mother, who was a very sweet woman. We had been close. But when she saw me, she shrieked, "Get her out of here, I can't look at her," and collapsed in her chair. My stupid shaved legs that I'd waited so long for, my greasy hair, my acne, my breasts, they were all brutal reminders of what Kelly, whose bones were in a casket at the other end of the room, would never be. My very existence, my beating pubescent heart, shattered my best friend's mother. And her naked despair shattered me. But if I could go back in time, I'd do it all again. I'd show up. So I'm a mother now. I have 2 very beautiful, healthy little girls, and I try to protect them from a lot of things in the world. But I also encourage them to show up, to care, to do the often lonely, scary, painful work of showing up. So recently, one of my daughters shared a decision she had made with me. She was working on her birthday party guest list, and as you parents know, that is a big deal. And she had decided to leave off one friend, a cool girl I'll call Harper. She has another friend, a sweet girl I'll call Lucy, who struggles a lot in life and particularly struggles with her peers. She gets teased a lot and she doesn't get birthday party invitations, but she was getting this one and she was very excited. So Harper's not one of the kids who teases Lucy, but she does roll her eyes at Lucy's very frequent social blunders. And apparently Lucy knows it. So for my daughter, in addition to cake and revelry for her own birthday, what she really wanted was to create an environment where struggling, awkward Lucy could relax and have fun for a couple of hours. My daughter's generous decision is not going to reverse Lucy's social isolation. And if word gets out, leaving out cool Harper for awkward Lucy may cost my girl, my shy, bookish girl, much needed social capital. But I've been the kid who risked and lost her social capital to stick with a struggling friend. And as excruciating as it can be to do the right thing, I supported my daughter's decision and shared how proud I am of her. Now, it may seem overblown to equate generosity in a birthday party guest list with loyalty through a multi-year battle with cancer and metastases, but the thing is, I didn't go in with a cape and a plan and grand gestures. I just showed up. I just made one small decision after another to stick with my best friend who I adored, despite the fear of cancer and despite what the cool kids thought. So I think my daughter is doing the same thing that I was doing. She's showing up. She's going out of her way to help a struggling friend. Cool kids be damned.
I just need to throw in a little editorial after that beautiful piece. I was at the Moth a couple of nights ago, the Moth main stage down at the Cutler. I was down at the Moth at the main stage a couple days ago, and the woman sitting next to me halfway through started essentially crying and saying that her faith in humanity has been so tattered lately, and listening to stories is restoring her faith in humanity, even as we sat there, and I'm experiencing the same thing here, so thank you. On Patriots' Day in 2015, my eldest son, Kenzie, who was 19 at the time, got on his bicycle in San Francisco, turned the bicycle to the east, and began biking home to Arlington by himself. About 5 weeks later, his younger brother, Cooper, and I took a plane to Colorado to meet him about halfway through his trip. And so it came to pass that I stood under the awning of a Comfort Inn motel in Pueblo, Colorado, and watched my 19-year-old son bike up a hill after going through 4 states, 1,400 miles, and 75,000 feet of vertical climbing. He loped up in front of me, sat easily in his saddle, and it was for all the world like seeing a cowboy ride in from the west. He was darker, his skin was leathery, he was thicker, and his eyes had the visions of everything that he had seen, and this absolute, complete, 100% thrill with himself that he had done it. And I put my hand out on his new bicep and had to step back with my chest filling up and my heart going pop in a way that it hadn't popped since the day of his birth, 19 years previously. We spent 36 hours together as a family in Pueblo, and during that time, he gave stories now and again about things he had seen and done. Biking through California with his brother, the foothills, the Sierras, the snow. Hitting Nevada, back-breaking Nevada, 19,000 vertical feet of climbing, 6 miles up, 5 miles down, 7 miles up, 6 miles down, 9 days of that. In the Nevada heat, with no shade, except for the little tiny, thin speed limit signs that in Nevada read 80. And then Utah, the back-breaking, soul-sucking Utah. Snow, peaks, RVs, and this dreadful isolation that he told us led to him weeping for entire hours. Weep and bike, bike and cry. 9 days in Utah. Just to get to the Rockies. 8 days in the Rockies, always ascending, until he finally got to the Continental Divide, which was so brutal that all I have left to describe it is the statistics of being at 14,000 feet in 6 feet of snow. 19 years old. And we're in Pueblo. And we're talking about how it started, none of us can remember, and all the naysayers, all the people who were so afraid for him and so sure that he would be murdered or hit by a semi or abducted or whatever, and all the people, all the parents who said, oh, I could never let my son do that. Like, what am I going to say? If you ride your bike, you don't get to go to college? Not to mention, this is what teenagers are supposed to be doing. If we were in a different culture, he would be out bagging an antelope or walking through the desert with a shaman with mushrooms, and surely this is better than mushrooms. Probably. One night, the last meal that we had was in a diner outside Pueblo, and I asked him if he ever felt like quitting. And he said, oh yeah, all the time. And I said, like weekly? And he said, no, like hourly, like almost every minute. And I said, well, how do you keep yourself from quitting? And he said, well, I just figured out that if I just keep pedaling, then I won't quit. I was like, what? He said, I just keep pedaling, and that way I don't quit. And I sat there in that diner and looked at his hands sitting there and new hands on the Formica, and I had to lean back again as my chest filled up and my heart went pop. The next morning, we took him out to the country road that he had biked in on, and once again, he took his bike and he went east, a teenage boy by himself on a bike in the high Colorado prairie. And that night, he reached Kansas. And a few weeks later, he reached, I know he's going to forget the name of it. He reached Williamstown, Massachusetts. And the next morning, in the best shape of his life and clearly smelling the stables, as we say out west, he biked the entire Berkshires, 117 miles, 5,000 feet of climbing, the most he'd done since the Rockies, and he landed in Westford right at dusk. I put him up in a hotel that night, the Comfort Inn, for old time's sake. And he told me that the next morning he was going to bike to Bedford, and then he was going to catch the Minuteman bike path and bike home, which I thought was a nice touch since that's where I taught him to bike. So he told me he'd be home around 10, and I went out on my steps and I waited for him, and by noon he was not there. And I did, I will confess, have a little bit of the voices of the naysayers in my head, thinking, really, could he have really biked 3,900 miles and 96,000 vertical feet and get hit by a semi outside Route 2? He didn't. He was doing what teenage boys do. He had gone to Bedford. He had gone to the Whole Foods. He had eaten his way through the Whole Foods for 2 freaking hours. And eventually his brother and a friend ran out, biked him in, dropped back so that I could watch once again my boy bike up a hill from the west. Over the next few days, we fed him about 6,000 to 7,000 calories a day. And a few days later, he started his summer job, and a few months later, he moved to Cambridge for college. And he lives in Somerville with a group of his friends, and he doesn't talk to people much about this trip because, as he told me, he doesn't want to appear to be bragging. He still bikes a lot around Somerville and Cambridge and work and classes and friends and occasionally home. And on his increasingly rare visits home, I do actually try to go stand on the stairs so I can watch my boy bike up the hill from the east this time. Because every single time, without exception, my chest fills up and I feel my heart pop. Thank you.
I can barely make it on my bike from Arlington to Waltham. This is for Colin Kaepernick. There are moments in your life that seem so insignificant, but that change who you are. I want to take you back 34 years when I was 20 years old and I was in charge of affirmative action in New Hampshire at a store. A large store, 300 people. So I was, in 1983, I was in college. I didn't have any money, so I found a job at Sears. And after about 7 months of selling wrenches, Linda Hamilton, the head of human resources, found me a new job. She brought me into human resources and put me in charge of interviewing applicants. And then a few months later, she made me in charge of affirmative action. So my job was to screen every candidate that came into that Sears store and reject them or accept them. And then I had to fill out a report of their gender, their race, the job they applied for, and what we interviewed them for. There were 300 people in the store. 298 of them were white men and white women. At the bottom of this huge spreadsheet, there was 2 minorities, a black guy and a Hispanic woman, custodial. So everything went great. The first couple of months, no minorities, nobody left, nothing changed. But things happen that you don't expect, and the black guy left. So we had a job to fill, and we had an affirmative action goal. It was on me to do something about this. So James came in to apply for a job. He was wearing a tan 3-piece suit, buttoned up, and a tie, looked very professional, probably in his 30s. And there I was, in a green Izod Lacoste shirt, with a yellow, bright a very bright knit tie. It was 1984 after all. I interviewed James. It was a great conversation. I told him about the Sears and what it was like to work there, and then we talked a little bit about what he wanted to do. I could see him getting his confidence up. He said, I want to work in accounting. Great. Do you have any experience in accounting? Well, you know, part-time jobs, and, you know, I've been working on studying, and, you know, this is my dream, what I want to do. So we had a great conversation about him, and I could see that, you know, he didn't have the experience, but he certainly had the passion, and he seemed like a good person. So we talked in the conversation, and I went to my boss and I said, you know what, I think we should advance James for the open accounting position we have. She didn't say anything, and I remembered that she had seen James walk in. James was black. We had an open goal to fill a black male in automotive customer service. So I want to take you back a little bit further, back to 1970. I was in first grade in elementary school, and I was a pretty shy kid, but I met my best friend. We fell in, we talked about our dreams and what we wanted to be. We both wanted to be baseball players. Carl Yastrzemski, Hank Aaron. We had such a great time on the playground. Unfortunately, after a couple of months, my friend left. He moved away. I don't remember his name, but I do remember watching him on the playground, smiling, dreaming. And I remember he was black. So then 2 days after James had come in, Linda, my boss, said she wanted me to talk about affirmative action. So we spread out this spreadsheet, and we looked at our one goal in automotive customer service for a black male, and she said, let's put James there. He needs a job. And I said, James doesn't want to work in customer service. He wants to work in accounting. And she said, I know, but we can't put him in accounting. We can't create an affirmative action goal in accounting. So then I said, well, Linda, we can do it. I'll fill out the forms. I'll do everything we need to do. Let's try him. No, Scott, we can't put him in accounting. And she walked away from me. And I followed her. I said, Linda! She turned around, said, we can't put him in accounting. We won't. And I said, he won't be happy. And I remember she looked at me right in the face and she said, it's not our job to make people happy. This was the moment that changed who I was. At this moment, I realized that I needed to reconcile inside of myself the desire to make James happy and give him what he deserved, or to do what I was supposed to do. So we put James, the accountant, in automotive. I didn't have any say in the whole matter. And I walked him out, and I left him there, and I didn't say anything to him. And I remember thinking that I didn't know what to say, because I didn't know what it felt like to be a small pencil mark on a big white spreadsheet. So a couple of weeks later, I watched James from a distance. I could see him failing, uncomfortable, unhappy. James quit about a month later. You could call it affirmative action. And then we had another goal in automotive customer service. James Baldwin said that you can, oh, damn, I forgot it. There are moments in your life when you can choose to accept what is before you and change it or not change it. So this was the moment for me that I realized that I needed to work with Linda, that I needed to spend more time and focus on listening to what humans were about than trying to fill in the spreadsheet. Our next minority candidate did not go in automotive. And over the next several years, I worked with Linda to find the right job for people. And I've devoted my life to trying to make that connection for people. And that's why I'm here in front of you today, standing up to tell you this story. Thank you.
So, I was a fat kid. And as anyone who has ever been heavy knows, this is a cruel world for them, especially in school. Now, I wasn't only just chubby, but I also had frizzy hair. And I have to tell you a story about my frizzy hair. So, I was born and raised in Iran, and when I was about 14, we took a trip to London. And that was when my father had finally agreed to buy my mom a fur coat. Now, in those days, wearing fur was okay. Now, of course, wearing fur is never okay, but we didn't know that then. So we went to this furrier place and this store, and I mean, just being in London, and so this woman who must have been at least 80 years old, full makeup, big, blonde hair, she came over and she was going to show my mother all these fur coats. So my mother would wear one after the other, and I have to say, my mother was chubby herself, but you know, she had a beautiful figure, but she was on the pleasantly plump side. So she would wear these mink coats and come out and say, "How does this look?" And I would be just laughing because it looked like my mother was wearing an animal and walking around. So I was just laughing and slapping my knee and all of that. And my sister, who was with us, she lived in the Netherlands at the time, and so she had joined us in London. And she was much older than me, almost 30 years old. So she was telling her, "Oh, Mommy, I don't think this is the best fit. I think this makes you look a little big," and all of that. So, but I was, of course, laughing and having a good time. And then this lady came up to me, and I was laughing and all of that, and she said, "Why does this boy laugh so much?" So, of course, at that point, because I knew enough English that I was dabbled over. I mean, that was it. I was laughing. So we finally came out of the store, and my sister was laughing because I was called a boy, and I was dabbled over. But my mother was laughing from the inside because she got that fur coat. She didn't get the mink, because even she understood that there are limits, but she got a nice black coat. So this is the way that I was perceived by others, like a chubby boy. And so I came, this is actually the prequel to my story. The sequel was this. So the prequel is that I was maybe about 6 or 7 years old, and I lived in a big house with my parents, and it was a lonely existence because my 3 other siblings, they had already left home. My brother was in college in Texas, studying petroleum engineering, of course, because we're from Iran. And my sister was living in the Netherlands, and also it was lonely in that house. And so my mother made a point of bringing my cousin, who was a lovely, lovely girl, a year younger than me. And whenever she would come with her two brothers, my whole world would change because they were so fun, and especially because I loved her so much. Now, she was the opposite of me. She was tiny with very slim legs, but what made her even more special in my eyes was that she had this incredible shiny black hair all the way to her waist. She was beautiful. And to sort of accentuate that, her mother would put this red bow in her hair. And she looked lovely with her red bow shining. I remember when we would play together, sometimes you would lie down on the bed, and her hair looked like patches of black silk on the white pillowcase. And I loved it. So on that one day, my mother invited some friends whom she knew casually. So these weren't people who really knew the family very well. And so on the same day, I had a play date with my cousin. Her name is Azadeh. She too now lives in the Netherlands. And so Azadeh and I were playing downstairs, and then we heard that there was a lot of goings on upstairs, so we came to see who was there. So we came, and she was more sort of confident, let's say. And so she ran into the room, and all these women were sitting there, and I stood back at the door, and I looked in. My mom was sitting there, and her friends, and the teacups, and the silverware was out and all that. And all of a sudden, one of these ladies looked at my cousin Azadeh, because they knew that my mother had a younger child, much younger than she should have had. And so they said, "Oh, Mrs. Masroor, is this your daughter?" And I was standing at the door, and my mom looked almost indignant. She said, "Oh, no. That is my daughter." And you know what? No matter how much I was complimented by men and women as I grew older, well into my 20s, it took that long. But no matter how much I was complimented, never was it ever the same when that woman looked at me, chubby, very, very, very short hair, standing at the door, and she said, "That is my daughter." Now that's what I call a mom.
Okay, y'all, last one. 7 minutes till you get to stretch. Five years ago, my husband and I moved from Texas to this charming historic town of Arlington, Mass. And I thought to myself, now this is a perfect place for a midlife crisis. Don't get me wrong, I'm talking about the good kind of midlife crisis, the kind that involves lots of happy adventures and does not involve Botox or infidelity or expensive red sports cars or anything like that. And truth be told, I was in about the 7th year of this midlife crisis already. And Arlington seemed like the perfect place to resolve it because everything I needed was right here. You have to understand, if you grew up here, that I come from a land of beige stucco strip malls and vast treeless parking lots. And so to wake up in a town where everything I needed was right there, I could go to the bakery and my dentist and dance classes and the post office and a charming classic movie theater all within walking distance. It felt like I had been magically transported to the little Fisher-Price village I used to play with when I was growing up, the little main street that opens up. So this was the stage for exploring many lifelong dreams, both professional and personal. And I tacked on the extra goal of that I wanted to get to know the town and make some friends because I was new. So, goal number one, my career goal. Ever since I was a teenager, I had wanted to own my own flower shop. I had worked at a florist in high school and again in college, and I had actually done a business plan with 5 years of return on investment projections, but I just never had the courage to go for it. And so instead, I became a cubicle-dwelling corporate marketing manager like everyone else, and I bought myself flowers once a week as consolation. But at this moment in time, I had the wherewithal, I had the freedom to try working at a florist again and to really decide, you know, am I going to put this dream to rest or am I going to put it into action? So I started looking in the one ads, but all I was seeing was like these ancient cobwebby mom and pop shops or these severe minimalist modern shops, and until Derby Farm popped up, and it was just right, and it was just down the street on Mass Ave. And so many things about Derby Farm fulfilled my florist fantasies. The shop was beautiful and cozy, like a little English cottage. I went home smelling like flowers. I got to chat with friendly people all day long, and the owner, Barbara Popolo, if any of you know Barbara, she knows almost everyone in town. It was sort of like Arlington immersion, Arlington 101. I learned things like why you can't swim in Spy Pond and the best times to go to the res. But then there were the glass vases. Endless shelves of glass vases that we had to wash every day, and endless shards of glass vases from all the ones I broke almost every day. I think I still hold the record at Derby Farm for most vases broken. And I can't say that, you know, the broken vases were, you know, the thing that shattered my florist dreams, pun intended, but it didn't help. It was really the retail life was much too tied down for a freewheeling kind of gal like myself. And, but in the end, pursuing my florist goal actually helped me achieve my other goal of making friends and fitting in Arlington. Although meanwhile, I had realized that all I had to do to make friends was go sit on my stoop on Milton Street. Basically, if I brought out some beer and sangria, it helped a little, and it was just instant block party. You'll never be lonely again if you become a stoop sitter in East Arlington. Anyhow, the second thing was my personal goal, and it was a bit of a cliche for a midlifer like me. I wanted to play in a rock band. Now, you can't just decide to play in a rock band. You can't just, you know, like, you have to find the right band, and you have to audition, and you have to know how to play an instrument, at least a little. And believe me, a little was all I had from childhood piano lessons. But one life-changing weekend at Ladies Rock Camp Boston gave me the courage to go for it. And as it happened, as luck would have it, my keyboard instructor at camp was Sharon Crumrine, who has a studio right here in Arlington Center. And I started taking private lessons with Sharon. And about a month in, she says to me, I have some friends who are looking for a keyboardist for their band. Oh, but I'm so old, I said to her. Oh, well, so are they, she said. But I'm so uncool, I said. Yeah, well, so are they, she said. But I'm a terrible musician, I said. Well, she said, let's just say I think you'll be able to keep up. And she was right. So thus began my 3 years as keyboardist for a middle-aged goth band. And it checked all the boxes of my rock star dreams. Got to, collaborating on original songs, check. Hanging out in the green room and taking cool band photos, check. Coming up with an alter ego complete with heavy eyeliner and cool steampunky outfits, yep, did that. Hanging out in seedy dive bars and playing at midnight, yeah, check, 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 until I just really couldn't even stand one more long dark corridor or sticky floor. One day last summer, I was swimming at Mystic Lake. Actually, I wallow more than I swim, so I was wallowing in Mystic Lake when I suddenly realized that my midlife crisis was over. It had been more than a decade, and I finally had settled into this second half of my life. And I was freelancing out of my home, and I loved the freedom of that. I had joined a new band. I was learning all sorts of great things with them, and everything was going wonderfully. And then that evening, I was out walking the dog, and I passed by Drum Connection on Mass Ave, and the Arthur Murray Dance Studio down by Alewife, and I started dreaming again of leading a drum circle and participating in ballroom dance competitions, and I thought, oh boy, here we go again. But at least if I'm going to continue to be this restless, I know that Arlington has got my back. Thank you.
So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and I want to give one more nice, really round of applause for our storytellers for being so brave and sharing with us tonight. And you'll see on the back of your program I had a lot of thank yous, and the first one was for the storytellers, and the last one was for you, everyone who came out here tonight. And you know, even though it was a little noisy when we were adding chairs, I knew it was great because it meant more people were coming. So I'm really happy that everyone came, and there are some other people I just wanted to thank really briefly. The members of the Arlington Human Rights Commission. If you guys who are here want to stand up. We're there. I'm a relatively new commissioner, and I basically came in and said I want to do this event and sort of dragged everyone along, and I'm just really happy that they went along with it and that you're all here today. Arlington Community Media, who are here today filming. And this event is actually the culminating event of a 3-month process that we started with Arlington Community Media, and we had a storytelling workshop that was at Ready Set Kids in September, and then over the course of October, people came in and auditioned, and Katie, who's right over there, was my partner in crime, and we filmed all the auditions and then brought people in for coaching sessions, and I can't see out in there, but is anyone who was a storytelling coach for our storytellers? Is anyone here? Is there? Yes, Iman over there. You can stand up for a second. Yes, hello. And so I want to thank everyone who helped our storytellers and coached them their story. Abby Matheson from the Arlington Advocate, who's over here, and wrote some nice pieces about our event. And afterwards, I hope you'll stay and have some snacks, which are provided by Food Link. If you don't know what Food Link is, it's a great organization that makes sure food does not go to waste in Arlington and provides it also for the Arlington Food Pantry. So I'm really happy that we could have some yummy snacks from them. And I left off one person on here who I want to thank, who I always forget to thank. It was my husband, Matt, because they're. He designed the program and the sign outside, and he also watched my children when I was out every night for several months. So, big thanks to him too. So, and lastly, I just want to say I hope we can do this again, and I hope that you learned something new about people in your community. Maybe you thought about your own story that you'll want to share, or even in the next 45 minutes, if you introduce yourself to someone new here and get to know our community a little better. Okay? Thanks so much.